The Revenant Dead are the most powerful Lantern Corps in DC Comics, and you guys will see what I'm talking about as we get further into this. But it's been a while since we covered Green Lantern, and trying to get back into it, John Stewart's story in particular kind of follows the aftermath of all of this, so to understand everything going on with Hal and Kyle and Guy and John, we got to cover War Journal. So what this does is this initially picks up basically out in space with just astronauts doing astronaut stuff, right? Just exploring and whatnot, when they're all suddenly met by this just incredibly bright light that appears out of nowhere, and where one of them is facing her own demise, just kind of floating out there in space, basically untethered with seemingly no way to get her back. She's suddenly met by what's basically a dark star ring, only for her to come face to face with the Revenant Queen who possesses her. Now, what's the deal with this? Okay, so technically speaking, War Journals does have a kind of prelude or a prologue that's covered as backup features in Green Lantern from Jeremy Adams issues 1 through 3. All that really establishes is that in an alternate reality, the Revenant Queen had a vendetta against that version of John Stewart. That version of John Stewart was exceedingly powerful, and you'll actually see that this version of John in the main DC universe will start to become as powerful because he gets a whole new level of power here. It's kind of nuts. But the long and short of it is that alternate reality version of John almost killed the Revenant Queen. And so she literally fled that universe and showed up in the main DC universe with the intention of marshaling her forces and then presumably returning back to that alternate reality after killing the main DC universe of John Stewart. That was her intention. And so what this does is it picks up with John himself basically heading back home, specifically after having abdicated his role as a Green Lantern. Now, there were a lot of things that had gone on that had led to that leading up to this point in time. There was John's storyline in the Dark Sector when he was fighting Isak, the New God, and there were all kinds of things that went on. But basically, it all kind of came together with this idea that John had been through so much on a personal level, he essentially needed a break. And that was really compounded by the fact that his mother is developing Alzheimer's, dementia, and she's also dying. And so because of that, John just wanted to be back home and focus on the things that mattered. One of the big things to keep in mind here, though, is that John is basically mainlining the willpower aspect of the emotional spectrum. He doesn't traditionally need a ring just because it's now a part of him. And so that's why at this point in time in John Stewart's story, the United Planets have essentially taken over the universe, which is to say they control everything behind the scenes. The traditional Green Lantern Corps has been restructured into what's basically a paramilitary force. And so what ends up happening is that one of these guys, a guy by the name of Lantern Veyron, shows up to Earth. Because at this point in time, John Stewart is an unauthorized Green Lantern. And literally what John just says, I don't have a ring, I don't need a ring. The response of Veyron is to say, my ring detects hard light energies here. Every ring wielder on this planet has been accounted for except for you. You have broken interstellar law. This structure is forfeit to the United Planets and all residents are under arrest. So quite literally, he puts chains on John. And John responds in probably one of the most badass lines ever, where he just says, I understand you're not from here. You don't know the culture. I get that. But let me explain something to you. If you ever try to put a chain on me again, you better learn how to use that ring first. And John just fires up a construct and crushes this guy. It's not even close. This dude had no clue what he was stepping into picking a fight with John Stewart. Because John Stewart fans will tell you, man, like they will tell you right now, John Stewart is not the guy to screw with. He is not the guy to screw with. What's so crazy about this is that as soon as this fight breaks out and Veyron realizes that he's overwhelmed, he yields. And John's just like, you're no kind of lantern at all, are you? Right? A Green Lantern wouldn't just give up suddenly. And that's where Veyron is like, you do have a ring. You have to have one if you're using willpower hard light constructs. And John's just like, I don't need a ring anymore. The Guardians would have known that. And so he says, tell the United Planets and the other fake lanterns that I do not have a ring and I don't owe them anything. And if you or any others come looking for another fight, I will show what a real lantern can do. And just sends this guy flying out of the planet. It's kind of bonkers. Now, here's the crazy thing that goes on here. In the midst of all of this, Shepard suddenly appears at what used to be the space station before it was attacked by the Revenant Queen. Now, Shepard is a Green Lantern from the same alternate reality that the Revenant Queen is coming from. So he's literally left his universe and shown up to this one. The idea behind that bit of a prologue was that John Stewart in that alternate reality stayed behind to basically restore the Green Lantern Corps in that universe, essentially marshaling forces preparing for the Revenant Queen to return. Shepard's job was to travel to wherever it is the Revenant Queen was going and to save the John Stewart of that reality, which led him here. Now, here is something to point out here. On the surface, it looks like Shepard is talking to his ring, and maybe on some level he is, but there is actually a voice talking to him directly, a person, because when Shepard gets to the space station, he says, "This is it, right? She's been here." And this voice says, "Behold, the young lantern's keen deductive powers," noticing the gaping burn holes to which ordinary men are blind. Right? And so he asks, right, "Are the Radiant Dead aboard?" And this voice just says, "Oh yes, 100%. And it says, "On your guard, Lantern Shepard. It wouldn't do to get eviscerated on your first day in a new universe." And so that's kind of the crazy thing, is because he is talking to a person. The Revenant Dead make their move against Shepard. And for the most part, he's able to hold his own to a degree, but it's one of these things where he's kind of unprepared for what they are and what they're capable of. He kind of underestimated them to a degree, mostly because of the fact that even when he escaped this reality and in the moments where he was fighting against the Revenant Dead, he didn't fully understand the totality of their power. And so that's why he's basically overwhelmed, fighting this fight as best he can, but this voice comes out and says, "If the Radiant Dead have reached to Earth, you're on borrowed time. This battle will not be won here. The only way to destroy the Radiant Dead is to kill their queen, and you'll only find her by finding the one she's looking for. Get out of here and find John Stewart," which is exactly what he does, right? He literally disappears. Now, here's the thing. This is an important distinction to understand here, because right off the bat, people who are familiar with DC Comics and the Green Lantern mythos will say that the Revenant Dead are strikingly similar to the Black Lanterns, and in a lot of ways they are, but what differentiates the Black Lanterns from the Revenant Dead is the very idea of the Revenant Queen. Black Lanterns are literally just zombie lanterns, nothing more, nothing less. They represent or are harbingers of the death aspect of the emotional spectrum. Necron plays a part in it, but Necron is basically just the avatar of the death aspect of the emotional spectrum, right? So Jesus representing God, for using a really terrible analogy here. But the fact is, right, the death of Necron does not necessarily mean the death of Black Lanterns. In the same way that you could kill the whale or the bull or any of the other avatars of the Lantern Corps, and the Lantern Corps will still remain. It just requires the emotional spectrum to exist. With the Revenant Dead, the only way to destroy them is to destroy the Revenant Queen. So long as she is alive, the Revenant Dead will exist. And the Revenant Dead can burn through Green Lanterns. And this is actually something that we end up seeing in the Amazon rainforest, that you actually have Veyron, along with a few other members of the Green Lantern Corps, who show up here and kind of marshal themselves to a degree, with the intention of going after John Stewart again. Not only that, we actually find out that Veyron isn't supposed to be here. He was going after John Stewart against his orders in the hopes that even though he violated orders, the very act of capturing John Stewart, arguably one of the greatest of the Green Lanterns and the entirety of the Green Lantern Corps, that would curry favor with Tharos, the guy who runs the United Planets. The problem with this is that they ultimately catch up to a part of the space station that had crashed down on Earth and was housing the astronaut. When they arrive here, the Revenant Queen manifests, and she says, "I smell you, little lanterns. You have the stink of Oa about you," and immediately manifests her powers and takes these guys out. They never had a chance. These guys never stood a chance. Within seconds, they're immediately subdued and they're immediately taken out. And that's where she just addresses Veyron directly before she kills him. And she says, "You spoke a name. He is close then. Yes, we will punish him together, little lantern. The Guardian and the Builder, John Stewart." And so at that point, you switch over to Metropolis. Now, this is kind of a little segue of a moment, but it will become important later on, where you have John basically bringing his mother to visit John Henry Irons, right, also known as Steel. He's been a longtime member of DC, specifically since the death of Superman, and while he initially played a kind of extended member of the Superman family, you don't really see him all that often. But when he does show up, he's dope. Like, he literally wears a Superman steel suit and he carries a giant hammer. It's pretty dope. But what John's basically looking for here is a kind of purpose, right? He's looking for something to fill his time with if he's not going to be a Green Lantern, because his eyes are constantly on the sky, right? He's always looking out there in space, trying to fix things, build things, so on and so forth. And so this would kind of restore that sense of purpose to him. But there is a bit of a conversation between himself and his mom where he talks about the idea, or really asks the question whether or not she would want to live in Metropolis. That's actually a bigger point that we'll talk about here in a little while, because that's the second reason why he's here. But in the midst of all of this, Veyron, who is now corrupted by the Revenant Queen, as well as the other two former Lanterns, show up here and immediately attack John Stewart. And that's where John starts manifesting his willpower yet again, right? Channeling his Green Lantern abilities. The funny thing about this is that Veyron has learned, because where John's mother is literally praying and John tells her, right, stop, everything's going to be fine, that Veyron says, let her pray to her little god, Stewart. She has the right of it, right? Like, she is going to die and she is going to meet her maker. And so where John starts firing up his constructs, Veyron just says, clever fellow, Stewart, but you cannot save her. And so John kind of taunts him a little bit, right? Like, I mean, I literally just beat the crap out of you the other day, but if you want to go a second round, that's fine, right? I could use the practice. But that's where Veyron says, I'm grateful for our first meeting, Stewart. It taught me that I still had much to learn and led me to my mistress. And where John doesn't know who she's talking about, Veyron says, mortals name her the Revenant Queen. She knows you. You possess a weapon she desires above all else. And that's where John just says, I told you, creep, I do not need a ring. And Veyron just says, neither does she. And then he stabs John Stewart in the shoulder. Now, it doesn't seem like a huge deal, right? But then that's when Veyron just says, it is done, right? In another life, Stewart, you were her greatest enemy, the living watchfire that kept the Radiant Dead at bay. And now I've made you one of us, and every living thing will follow, because John is now infected with the energy of the Radiant Dead, and it's only a matter of time before he starts to turn. So all that really has to happen here is that Veyron has to wait it out. But because of the vendetta that Veyron has, and because of how much he just hates John Stewart, at the end of the day, he keeps fighting on the offensive anyway. And in the nick of time too, because John is weakening as this fight goes further and further. And all Shepard does is just kind of whisk Veyron away, right? Just basically send him flying with some Green Lantern birds. But that's when Shepard realizes that John Stewart has been stabbed and John Stewart is infected. And so in that moment, John kind of transitions into the mindscape. Quite literally, he's in his own mind, and he's talking to that same disembodied voice that was talking to Shepard now. And as he's running, right, this voice just says, you cannot outrun them, John. They will kill you if you try. And John just says, you're not real, right? I am dying, and you're just my own mind trying to recreate a familiar voice as it dies. And that voice just says, well, that's hurtful. Now, the fact that it's a familiar voice means it's someone John Stewart knows. That's the first clue as to who it actually is. And it's pretty dope when you get the reveal. But the voice tells him, I mean, you're definitely dying, but not real? I mean, look around you, right? And what's basically happening here is that where it has these giant tendrils coming out of the sky, it's essentially the infection overtaking his body. That's kind of what you're witnessing, is that inner turmoil taking place inside his own mind and his own body. Now, eventually he does wake up. And when that happens, he wakes up in Steelworks Tower with John Henry Irons. And they don't really know what's going on with him, right? The infection is actually spread in the time that he's been here, and it's run up his arm. And so where John takes a moment and he kind of gets out there and starts talking to Shepard, Shepard kind of turns against him, right? In the sense that he's just like, I was sent here to save this universe's version of John, but the reality here is that you're infected. There's nobody to save you. So I just have to go grab other lanterns and see if they can help as well. Like, that sucks, man, but like, good luck to you. And basically goes to abandon John. But in the midst of that, they're both whisked away because John seemingly starts to transform. And that's where Shepard says, you're in the space between moments, between the energies my ring and I create. I thought the legendary John Stewart would be less of an idiot. If I hadn't pulled you in here, you'd be one of them right now. And that's where that disembodied voice says, Shepard, your bedside manner is as terrible as ever. And John is just like, who is that? Right? Like, this is the second time I'm hearing the voice. I heard it in my head before. Now I'm hearing it again. What's going on here? And this voice just says, a cosmic plague called the Revenant Dead is burning across your planet, John. Their mistress, the Revenant Queen, brought them here because of you. And that's where John just says, you're the voice from my dream, but you cannot be the person that you sound like. And the voice just says, the souls of fallen lanterns are bound to this place, so we can continue to serve those who follow us. Lucky for you, only to find out it's Kyle Rayner. Now, it's not Kyle Rayner from the main DC universe. It's Kyle Rayner from the alternate reality that Shepard comes from. But the conversation between Kyle and John is incredibly important here, because the reality is that John Stewart is at a fork in the road. He's at a crossroads. Either he can stay here on Earth and he can ignore this entire conflict and potentially succumb to the power of the Revenant Dead himself, but he can be there for his mom in her dying moments. Or he can marshal himself, he can join Shepard, do what he can to stave off and defeat the Revenant Queen, but if that happens, his mom could die while he's in battle. And that's an important thing to know, because John has consistently had to make choices like this, losing people close to him all the time in some form or fashion. And where John teases the idea in saying, like, there's all kinds of lanterns out there, they're all just as capable as I am, right? You can basically grab all of them. That Kyle tells him they will try. Right? They will try to destroy the Revenant Queen. But the reality here is this. The fight starts here on Earth. You have, 7 some odd billion people on your planet. By the time the Green Lanterns even show up here and are able to deal with this threat, you're talking about the Green Lanterns, right? An army of, 7 to 8,000 people fighting an army that's like 7 billion strong, all of whom are equally powerful, if not more powerful, than the Green Lanterns. That fight will be over like that. And that's not even taking into account any of the other traditional superheroes that would be corrupted by the Revenant Queen. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the Flash, right? So it's one of these things where it's like, John has to deal with this, right? The Revenant Queen came here for him, so he's the one that's got to deal with this threat. And so what he ends up doing is basically going and visiting his mom, having a few moments. But the reality here is that she's unconscious. And so him leaving and becoming a part of this battle would basically mean that his mom may very well die while he's here. And so while there is an attempt, right, a kind of exercise within the mindscape of John Stewart trying to overcome the influence of the Revenant Dead, the reality is that he can't do it on his own, because the nature of the Revenant Dead infection is that the more he uses his powers, the faster he becomes corrupted. And so that's where a very important piece of information with this puzzle comes along. Because in this moment where Shepard just kind of encases him in a crystal and starts talking about the idea of everything being hopeless, Shepard tells him, right, the Revenant Dead, it uses your will, Stewart, the thing that made you powerful. It turns it against you. How are you supposed to fight that? And he says, when a lantern is turned, not even the ring escapes. It's severed from its battery, from the core. It dies along with its host. And that's where John immediately picks up on that. And it's just like, wait, like, say that again. Like, explain that to me. Because he says the dead lantern's ring does not take a new wearer, which is traditionally what happens. When any member of a lantern corps dies, the ring immediately seeks out a new host. That doesn't happen here, right? And as Shepard says, the ring is severed from the central battery. It becomes useless. And so that's where John says, in the fight on the train, Veyron and the other lanterns, they lost limbs. Did any of them leave a ring behind? And Shepard just says, yeah, I mean, this one, but I told you, it's useless. And so John is just like, before I was a fighter, I was a builder, and I have access to the best workshop in the entirety of this sector. And so what ends up happening is they take the ring to John Henry Irons, and John analyzes it. And it's just like, I mean, this is probably the most advanced thing that I think I've ever seen in my life, which is kind of a cool little tidbit here. John Henry Irons has never actually studied a Green Lantern ring before. So it's kind of dope to see him do it, to be honest with you guys. Right? But at the end of the day, he says, despite how incredibly capable this is, right, that it's a pocket dimension governed by the mind instead of the laws of physics, it detects and responds to feelings, to philosophical concepts. He says at the end of the day, though, it is a machine, one that's been cut off from its user, its battery, and the rest of the core, which theoretically opens the door to jumpstarting the ring with a new power source, which is the power source of Genesis, right? An infinite power source. We'll talk about what that means here in a minute, because it kind of ties in to the ending of the story. And so John Stewart's like, you're saying that we could basically use this. And John Henry Irons is like, yeah, 100%, right? We're just going to give it a different power source, but you're still going to be able to use this. And so what ends up happening is that in that moment, the Revenant Dead starts to corrupt him at a faster pace. And so where Shepard goes to help him out, they ultimately jumpstart the Green Lantern ring, and then that's where John realizes it wasn't broken, right? It wasn't corrupted, it wasn't screwed up, and it certainly wasn't useless. It just needed a new host, and it needed someone that was able to dominate the will of the ring with their own willpower. And that's exactly what John does. He dominates the ring itself. And when that happens, he's bestowed with a new Green Lantern ring. Now, this is an important thing here because in that moment, as he's dominating the ring's will, he actually ends up coming face to face with Veyron, specifically when he's basically in the kind of Revenant Dead mindscape, right? Where all these fallen individuals basically go. I don't know that I would necessarily call it an afterlife. It's just more of like an ethereal plane of existence. But what's really interesting here is what John says. That when Veyron asks him, right, how did you come by that ring? John's just like, I mean, what do you care? It's not like you even knew what to do with it. And he says, but like I told you, I have not needed a ring for quite some time. My connection to my power has become more intrinsic, but that wound that you gave me changes things. My power and yours seems like it all draws from the same place. I couldn't access it anymore without turning into one of you, unless, of course, I found another ring, one untethered to me, a battery, or any other living lantern. And so he says, thank you, Veyron. I couldn't have done it without you. And so what this does is it's given John Stewart a back door into the Revenant Dead, that now he knows where to find them, right? And seemingly he knows how to overcome them. And that's where things get nuts, because there is a kind of a ethereal battle between John and Veyron, but ultimately John gets the upper hand and basically escapes, wielding the power of the Lantern Ring. But it is important to specify here, he basically has two sources of Green Lantern abilities now, right? The source that is inherent to him, which he cannot use, and this Green Lantern ring that belonged to Veyron, which he is using. So he's like double the Green Lantern power, if he wanted to be. I don't know if somebody could be like double Green Lantern, but it would be kind of dope if they could. And so the first thing he does is he tells the ring, show me where the Revenant Dead are. And that's when he realizes the Revenant Dead are everywhere. That while he was fighting against Veyron and all that kind of stuff, the Revenant Queen has been traveling around Earth and just killing pretty much anybody that she happens to come across and bringing them in to the Revenant Dead. So her forces are marshaling almost at like an exponential rate. But in the midst of all of that, John, of course, thanks John Henry Irons for letting his mom stay there and so on and so forth. But then he actually learns the truth about what's going on here. That Steele's niece, right, tells him, look, you have to tell John the truth about what's going on with his mom, right? And so that's when they basically reveal that like the whole fight and that injury that she sustained in the battle on the train has actually exacerbated her mental condition. And basically she's descending further and further into not really knowing what's going on around her, kind of getting lost in herself. And so John initially goes to speak with her, but there's a very important statement here where he's told, your mom keeps talking to your father, who's not there anymore. And then she also keeps talking about a girl named Ellie. Now, technically, Eleanor Stewart is new here. She was created during the Dark Crisis event by Philip Kennedy Johnson, but the fact is, she's the younger sister of John Stewart, and at some point along the line, she died when she was a little girl. The issue is that with John Stewart's mom developing Alzheimer's and dementia, she doesn't remember that Ellie is dead, and that's why she keeps asking for her. So when John goes to visit his mom, that she starts to realize that, like, this isn't the house that belongs to her. She doesn't know where she is. She's exceedingly confused. Where's Ellie, right? What happened to Ellie? And so John is just kind of like, okay, right? Like, if there's any one thing that I can do to at least help her mental condition, it is to allow her to believe that the world that she thinks is real is actually real. So taking a page out of Hal Jordan, and this is a very dangerous game he's playing, he ends up using his power to conjure a construct of Ellie. So for those of you guys who picked up with like Green Lantern, the Civil Corps from Jeremy Adams, and you don't really know how it is that like Ellie shows up, this is where it happens. She's a hard-like construct created by John. And so we just ask her, right, do you understand what you are? And Ellie says, I am your heart, your mind, your memories, and your will most of all. I am a piece of you, imbued with your power and your love for Shirley Stewart, and I will die before I let anything happen to our mom. And that's where John is just like, that's my girl. And so it allows some normalcy to return to John's mom, even if it's not really an absolute truth. The reason why I say this is a dangerous game is because Hal Jordan did this in the aftermath of the death of Superman, when Coast City was destroyed. And then he was ultimately chastised by the Guardians of the Universe, and then he went crazy, he was corrupted by the Parallax Entity, and then Emerald Twilight kicks off. So it's kind of a dangerous game to play here, but it is one that he does nonetheless. And so in the midst of all of this, John and Shepard are like, let's go hunting, right? Let's go find the Revenant Queen. And so what ends up happening is that there are some Green Lanterns that are sent to Earth by the United Planets to basically deal with the threat of John Stewart and the belief that John was the one who had killed Veyron. But of course, the Revenant Queen shows up and basically writes all that misinformation. And she just says, Lanterns of Oa, John Stewart, you have come at last. And she says, you're too late, John. As you can see, this planet is now mine to its very core. Your ego was ever your downfall. You were so focused on the infection spreading within your body, you never saw the light devouring your very world. And so at that point, the fight between the Lanterns and the Revenant Dead is pretty extreme here, because the Revenant Dead are numbered in like the dozens, if not potentially 100 folks here. And it's just something to keep in mind. This has only happened within a matter of like hours, potentially a day or so, right? We're not really given a definitive time frame here, and we don't really see like night passing or anything like that. So the only real context we get is the conversation he has with Steel. So like a couple days have passed, but it's kind of nuts because in that moment, the other Lanterns basically ally themselves with John Stewart, even though they are technically enemies, right? But the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Not only that, it gives Shepard the ability to put on display what he's capable of, creating just like these crazy fantasy birds that are clearly the eagles from Lord of the Rings that the hobbits and those guys were too stupid to use so they could just fly into Mordor, right? But the fact is, right, it's pretty dope seeing Shepard just conjure these constructs. There's almost a page out of Kyle Rayner because it's the exact same thing Kyle Rayner would have done. And so he and John Stewart fighting together are able to take out a lot of these Revenant Dead. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really make any difference because not only are the Revenant Dead servants of the Revenant Queen, they still maintain whatever abilities are inherent to their particular race, specifically with Veyron, when he directly addresses John Stewart. And he says, you know we Durlans have the power to change our shape. Yes, among our yellow-skinned lowlanders, it is a common enough trick, but such games are beneath a high Durlan. For one of us to imitate a lesser thing is to disrespect one's station. Imagine one such as I taking the shape of a Thanagarian or a Coloan, or even a Terran such as you. This was your father's form. Yes, when we were connected in the ring, I learned a great deal of you, and I wonder if your mother will remember it too. But of course, John doesn't really do one for mind games, right? It's a very difficult prospect to like somehow turn John Stewart's mind against him and get under his skin in that way. And Veyron learns that lesson quick, fast, and in a hurry, because John Stewart fires off what may be the biggest gun that I have ever seen. And it's just like, don't talk about my mom. Right? So like Veyron learned pretty quickly, right? You don't dick around with John Stewart's family. Of course, this leads to John turning his attention to the rest of the other Lanterns. But what ends up happening is that one of them fires off their ring, right? And he says, tell the United Planets what happened here. And that happens in his dying moments. As soon as he's dead, the ring takes off and it just says, Space Sector 1417, scan for replacement sentient initiated. And so it seeks out a new host. Not only that, in the midst of all this chaos, John and Shepard are kind of back to back, right? Facing off against all these Revenant Dead, but they're not paying attention to where the Revenant Queen is. She teleports behind Shepard and impales this guy. And this is where the new abilities of John come into play. Because what ends up happening is that John Stewart kind of has this recollection and a conversation with his mom when she says, once you were little, you got a hold of my mother's old clock and took it all apart, right down to the cogs, because you said you wanted to see how it works from the middle. And that's where John starts analyzing the very nature of Green Lantern power, the emotional spectrum. And Kyle Rayner asks him, right, what do you see, John? And he says, it's just light. Right? A sentient light that corrupts flesh, that transforms living things into light, like our constructs. It is profane, right? Kind of like a perversion of the traditional emotional spectrum. But he says, light is our weapon as Green Lanterns. We build with it, shield ourselves with it, arm ourselves with it. Like, what if we could do that, right? Could we do this too. Instead of building, we could transform with it. What if we became the light ourselves? The light of will, too bright and too strong to be corrupted. Incorruptible light and unassailable. A lantern made from that light would be invincible. And so literally John Stewart becomes a living hard light construct. He is the very essence of willpower made manifest, which is kind of nuts when you think about it, because now this dude is on a whole new level of power. And so that's why he turns his attention to the Revenant Queen. And it's just like, tell us who you are, right? Tell us what's going on here before we destroy you. At the very least, give us that. And all she really does is she says, this form that I have is one of many forms. I have taken multiple forms over existence. When I was in that alternate reality, I took the form of your wife, who was pregnant with your unborn child and who was a lantern herself, and I will continue to take forms. And she says, but the reality here is that I am much more than these petty beings. I am an unliving lament for she whose murder once laid low a universe, a lament in her image, born of the will of her terrible, beautiful father, Olgrin of the first world. An old god, not a new god, right? Dark Side, High Father, those guys are new gods. The old gods predate them, and the old gods are immensely powerful. So this girl being a product of one of those, it basically shows why she's so capable. She's literally a living curse, capable of just cutting a swath through the multiverse. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end because poor John Stewart's soul, he gets yanked away by the Revenant Queen. So we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you all later. Peace.